All right, welcome back to the DTVC Extra podcast. We are continuing our look at the Star Trek original cast franchise with numbers 3 and 4 today. So, yeah, and before I get into number 3, one of the things I wanted to do is kind of go back and sort of set the stage again, kind of for where these movies lie, sort of in the film industry at that time. Because last time when we did this, it was more about where Star Trek was, right? Where the series had ended 10 years before, sort of the building of the fandom, and that sort of I would say coinciding with the success of Star Wars in the sense of like Paramount maybe wanting their own Star Wars. What's interesting with number 3 is that number 3 comes out in 1984, and at that point, we're like about 9 years, almost 10 years into what I consider to be almost like the new era of the blockbuster. I think of the blockbuster maybe pre-1975 is more like a kind of these epic movies, right? The Lawrence of Arabia's, the Ben-Hur, Dr. Zhivago, going back to like Gone with the Wind. Someone said maybe even going back as far as Birth of a Nation and movies like that from the silent era. Metropolis would be another one you think of. But the idea, at least with sort of the kind of that later, from the 30s through till like the 60s period, those epics were meant to be these sort of epic film events, right? That everybody would go see it. Everybody would plan to go see it for the summer. They'd be these massive productions, 3.5 hours, 4 hours long with an intermission, right? You know how I feel about the intermission. But the idea would be almost like a prestige piece for the director involved, for the actors involved, for the studios involved, right? That was kind of the idea. And what's interesting is Paramount, the film, the distribution company that handles the Star Trek films, they are one of the ones that are kind of spearhead the movement to sort of get away from those kinds of movies, right? You think of the sort of director auteur-driven films of the late 60s, early 70s, with names like Polanski and Coppola, and Scorsese didn't work with I'm not sure if Scorsese did any films that were distributed by Paramount, but it's that idea, right, that those were the kinds of movies that were out at that time. And so thinking of like what a new blockbuster would be, along comes Jaws in 1975, right? It's a movie that it didn't start out big, but it grew into becoming the largest grossing picture of that year. And, thinking about how that movie would have existed in the 70s, I feel like if you're, of that time, right, you probably would have looked at the poster and thought, what is this, just another Blob or Creature from the Black Lagoon or what, some kind of campy horror film. And so maybe the campy horror fans go see that and enjoy it and say, wait, actually, I think everybody I know would like this. And they start talking to friends and family and say, hey, you've got to go see this Jaws movie. You're really going to like it. Are you sure? I don't really like that kind of, no, trust me, you're going to like it. And that word of mouth builds, right? And suddenly this thing becomes this massive phenomenon. 2 years later, it happens again, right, with Star Wars, where Star Wars from a science fiction standpoint, yes, it drew from things like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and things like that from the past, right? But it's ultimately something completely new in a sense of like there's no way that you could have understood what Star Wars would be without watching it in the theater, right? I remember reading about or seeing something about how like when people were looking at the scripts for Star Wars, they just it was all in Lucas's head. Nobody could really comprehend what that would end up being. But it was a similar phenomena, right? That people went and saw Star Wars, they told people about it, and other people went and saw it. I think one maybe slight difference between Star Wars and Jaws, I think, is that Jaws, I think Star Wars had more repeat viewers, whereas Jaws had more like a broader, like, new people going to see it because they had to experience. But I think Star Wars, you had people that literally turned around after seeing it once and went right back in the theater and saw it again, right? That's the kind of repeat viewership that Star Wars engendered. But, interesting enough, right, that you've got two names creating these films, Spielberg and Lucas, who they're from that auteur new director generation, right? So they're of the same age cohort as Scorsese, as De Palma, Coppola, all of those names, Polanski, and they come from similar backgrounds. That they were also watching the same names that these directors were watching, right? They were watching not Spielberg. They were watching Bergman. They were watching Kurosawa. All those names, right? That they were drawing from as well. But they also kind of drew from this like, pulp like serial past, right? I mean, that's one of the things I think with Lucas. They said that when he did Star Wars, he originally wanted to do an adaptation of Buck Rogers and he couldn't. So that's kind of what he made his own version of it, which of course ends up being a much bigger phenomenon, right? But that's the idea, is that the idea, that they're sort of marrying these two pasts, right? And I think what's interesting about that is that there was a camp prior to that, right? When it came to these kinds of things, that you think of Batman, like the old Batman, it kind of made fun of those serials, right? You think of, you watch Mystery Science Theater 3000 today, right? And of course, those guys would have been about 10 years younger than those directors, but they still would have grown up seeing those like 50s, sci-fi films, 50 horror films, and made fun of them and gotten a kick out of them. Whereas Spielberg and Lucas tapped into something special about those and made it into this like mass like appeal, right? That everybody enjoyed. And so I think that's part of it, right? Is that blockbusters at the time are one, they're sort of, they're not like worried about opening weekends and immediate gross, right? They're allowed to sort of exist in the theater for a little bit longer and generate an audience and generate a buzz about them. But the other thing too is that they're drawing on this past that we considered to be campy at the time. And they made something special out of it, right? Something beyond just, they're fun movies, of course, but they're even something beyond that, right? They're beyond just a genre picture. So it's in that world, right, that in 78 we get Superman, right? Which is a similar phenomenon that I don't think people believed, right, that Superman would look the way Superman looked, right? I don't think they believed that Christopher Reeves would pull it off the way he did. I don't think that the flying effect, that people thought the flying effect would look as well. But it does still do that well, right? And what's interesting is we look at Paramount at that time, right? We think of Paramount today as having three major franchises, right? Star Trek, Transformers, and Mission Impossible, right? Those are kind of their big ones. But at that time, right, franchises didn't work the way we think of it now, right? It's not like you're looking on building these 6 to 8 movie arc kind of things, right? It's more like, you get a hit and let's see how much more blood we can get from that stone, right? I think it's 78, a second Jaws movie comes out with Roy Scheider. He didn't really want to make the movie. Spielberg wasn't involved with it, but it's just sort of like, let's see. And then of course Jaws 3D comes out, in the early 80s. But what's interesting about Paramount, right, is that Paramount was still kind of going around releasing the kinds of movies that that I was talking about, like the ones that aren't necessarily what you think of as blockbusters. But in that year in 78, right, they have Grease, which Grease tops Superman at the box office, right? It's a bigger deal at that time, and so those are Paramount was like, they had some other hits, right? Of course, you get one of the things I'd kind of forgotten about, right, is that Paramount released or they distributed the Indiana Jones films. So Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Huge hit for them in 81, which of course it makes it, it does better than Superman 2, right? Which again, we think of Superman as one of the kind of bigger franchises at that time. Paramount's doing even better with Raiders of the Lost Ark at that time. And then, of course, like in 84, when this film, Star Trek 3 comes out, they also have hits with Beverly Hills Cop, the second Indiana Jones movie, which people aren't as big a fan of, but that does really well. Footloose is pretty good at that time. So it's an interesting time at that because, from Paramount's standpoint, I think as they're going into these Star Trek films, they've got other ways that they're, other films that are making them money, right? And so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they would stick to Star Trek and make it work, right? Nowadays, right, it's like if you own a franchise, you feel like you've got to find some way to make it work, right? Whether it's like, Terminator or Charlie's Angels or whatever it is, right? You've got to somehow kind of make some money from it. From Paramount's standpoint, I think if Part 2 doesn't do as well as it does, Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan, if it doesn't do as well as it thinks it does, that ends up doing, right, we wouldn't have the rest of them. I imagine we probably still would have the Next Generation TV series, but I don't know that Paramount's putting as much into Star Trek, as they needed to, as they ended up doing with the other films. So Star Trek 2 kind of inserts itself in amongst these other franchises. And it's interesting because if you look at like a year like, for example, 1984, when this one comes out, you see a lot of franchises that they kind of just grow into something, right? Like, so Ghostbusters, of course, is the top film that year, and then it wasn't the top film that year. I think it was like one of those deals where it's like it was re-released the next year, and so it earned more than Beverly Hills Cop. But of course, Ghostbusters, right? It has a sequel that nobody really liked, nobody was really all that into, and then it was kind of Columbia, which is owned by Sony, they're like, well, we've got this thing now. Let's see if we can do something more with Ghostbusters. So now they're kind of trying to turn it into its own little franchise. Beverly Hills Cop was Paramount again. 3 movies, right? And then they call it quits, and now they're trying to bring it back somehow. Indiana Jones, I don't know how it went from Paramount to Disney. I don't know if maybe that was part of the Lucasfilm purchase, if Indiana Jones was included in that. But, similar idea, right? That at the time, 3 movies, we were good with that. And then, they called it good. Gremlins, 2 movies, Karate Kid, same thing. And then Police Academy, right? I mean, you get, what is it, was number 6 the one where they go to Russia or something like that? But that was kind of how franchises worked back then. You get 2 or 3 movies out. If the first one does really well, you do a couple sequels, if you're lucky, a couple sequels. In Ghostbusters' case, they were like, no, we're not doing any more after that. But there wasn't this idea of having this, 6 or 7 movie arc kind of thing. And so, with Star Trek, we think of Star Trek as having 6 movies, right? But not only having 6 movies, but having 3 kind of in between, 3 kind of a 3 movie series that kind of goes in between there. It again, with the way blockbusters went back then, it wasn't so much of, almost like franchises started themselves, right? You weren't really so much worried about tying it to something big or something like that. I mean, the only comic book ones you were seeing at that time, right, were Superman, and then later Batman comes in. But the other thing, again, is that, if after Star Trek 1, didn't do so well from Paramount's standpoint, right, I think they could have looked at it as, okay, if the Star Trek thing doesn't work, we'll just do something else. We'll just do another, it just happened that they had Star Trek to do their sci-fi version, so there's that piece there. Another thing I think to think about as we're getting into this, this film here is that, what we were understanding sci-fi to be was almost, I don't want to say elevated. I don't know if we use that term elevated a lot for things, and I don't know if that's what we want here. But with as I talked about with Spielberg and Lucas, with what they were doing with sci-fi, right? You're getting, obviously the Star Wars movies come off as sort of like the space opera thing. It's higher quality than your average sci-fi. And then you've got Spielberg, who's doing Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., which is, again, it's like a higher quality sci-fi. And I think that Star Trek went into making the first movie in '79, trying to do something similar, right? They wanted to, again, they said that they wanted to do 2001: A Space Odyssey, so that was the idea, right? So they were trying to do something along those lines, and it didn't work, right? It doesn't end up working out that way. I mean, granted, 2001 is a very lofty goal anyway, but I think the thinking is that maybe, Spielberg and Lucas were doing the same thing, but they were coming off a little bit better, right? Maybe that was the idea. But the other thing, right, is then, of course, when they go into number 2, they kind of roll it back a little bit. They want to do some sort of just regular space kind of, battle kind of, just a regular kind of space adventure with a great villain and all of that. And so when they pull that one off, Michael Eisner was working with Paramount at that time, and he, of course, he ends up going to Disney, right, and becoming a big deal there. But apparently the opening weekend was so big on the second movie that he greenlighted, whatever, however you want to say it, the third movie, on the spot, right? And it's let's do a third movie. But again, going into this third movie, again, just looking at the nature of how blockbusters were at that time, and that it wasn't so much about tying things to franchises, but rather, if a movie's successful, you kind of get as much blood out of that stone as you can, and then move on to the next thing. It wasn't a foregone conclusion there was going to be a third movie. So when Eisner greenlights that third movie, now it's sort of okay, how are we going to put this thing into play? And I think there was a couple things in mind with that third movie going into it that I think are important kind of things to keep in mind as we talk about it, because one of the interesting things, right? One of the things, the classic, ideas about Star Trek, right, is that the odd number movies suck and the even number movies are great, right? So 1 sucks, 2 is good, 3 sucks, 4 is good, 5 is considered the worst, right, and then 6 is good as well. But I think 3, because of that, because I think we always kind of try to, shift things into binaries or corral things into binaries, good and bad, that kind of thing, that 3 gets lost in that a little bit. And I think watching it again here, and then also sort of looking at it in that context of what the greater blockbuster world was at that time, it gave me a better sense of what they were going for with this movie and sort of how it comes off. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this movie is going to be 40 years old this year. So it's interesting, right? We earlier on we celebrated, when we were doing the podcast, it was the 55th anniversary of the last episode. Now we're looking at 40 years since part 3 came out. So kind of crazy that's I don't know if it's going to be airing anywhere here in the States. I'll have to take a look and see, because like I said, I saw the first one when it was at its 40th anniversary. I guess they missed Star Trek 2 when that would have come around here in 2022. But yeah. Looks like we're going to be hitting a bunch of 40th anniversaries for these Star Trek films here as we go through the 2020s. But anyway, so we got the green light for Star Trek 3. And so now that's kind of putting into place what this story is going to be about, what they want to do. And so there was a sense going into it that when they made part 2, that they sort of left the door open for a sequel there. And so that was an idea, was that, okay, we're going to do... and I think there was an idea of maybe doing what became the 3-movie arc of 2, 3, and 4, that they had kind of planted the seeds for an idea for that in the second movie. There's a few things that they do in that second movie to give them the opportunity to make the third movie. So one is, before Spock dies, right, he mind melds with McCoy, so he gives his brain or his essence or whatever to McCoy, so that way that I guess it would be there if they ever needed it, right, for another movie. And then of course the coffin, right, when it goes on the Genesis planet, there's the idea of rebirth that could happen there. And Leonard Nimoy famously joked that when he saw the premiere, he saw that coffin there and said, okay, well, that I'm going to probably be getting a call from Paramount, right, because they're going to want me to make this movie. So that's that's kind of what ends up happening there. But a few things kind of happen between these two movies that I think is important to think about. One is that we had Kirstie Alley in part 2. She didn't sign on for the sequels, or she wasn't. They didn't put her into a contract for the sequels. So when they needed to bring her back, because they wanted Savak's character to be back in these, because again they're sequels, they're kind of direct sequels to the other movies. According to Kirstie Alley, they offered her less money but a bigger part. That was the plan for her, and she was like, well, why would I take less money for a bigger part? Wouldn't the whole point be that I'd get more money if it's a bigger part, right? So that was one of the things. I think on Nimoy's side, he said that her agent was pushing for more money when maybe he shouldn't have, or maybe he overdid it with that. Nimoy also said it was wrong of Paramount to sign her to a 1-film contract, knowing that there's a possibility of these sequels. They should have signed her to more movies. What I think kind of happened, I think from the agent standpoint, and this wasn't really talked about, and I don't know you would talk about it necessarily, but I think the agent was looking at Kirstie Alley's career, and I think, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, gives her, she's got more exposure than she's ever had before, right? So it's a kind of a bigger deal. And so I think that, in that sense, it helped her career. But if you look at that time, what it meant to be in like a sci-fi franchise, or even some kind of, genre franchise, right? It wasn't the best thing for your career. I mean, yes, if you're Harrison Ford and you go into the first Star Wars movie already being a star of some sort, right, then you're going to be able to make other films. But Mark Hamill wasn't getting pictures after Star Wars, outside of Star Wars. Carrie Fisher was having trouble getting stuff. And then from the Star Trek standpoint, I mean, yes, Shatner, he got T.J. Hooker, right, but was he getting a lot of stuff? Columbo episodes, right? That's mostly what I remember seeing him in the 70s, right? He did a lot of Columbo episodes. Nimoy wasn't getting much, right? DeForest Kelley, all of them, they didn't get a lot outside of that. And so, and also too, you could say the thing for Superman, right? What was Christopher Reeves getting for roles, outside of Superman? So I think from a career standpoint, the agent was probably like, listen, unless they're going to pay you a lot of money, and it's like life-changing money, it's not really worth it for your career to be tied to this Star Trek thing. So, something better will come along. And of course it did, right? Cheers comes along and she ends up becoming much bigger than I think she would have if she just stuck with the Star Trek movies. I kind of think that's what happened there. But either way, right? She gets replaced by Robin Curtis, who I think, fans of the podcast, fans of the DTV action world would know her from Blood Fist 6, where she plays the Major, who is, she's playing the kind of the Reginald Vell Johnson character, who is on the ground communicating with our hero, Don the Dragon Wilson, who's doing the Die Hard in a missile silo kind of thing. She's communicating with him, giving him intel and stuff like that. So you'd know her from that, and then also she plays the mom in Recoil, not the mom, not Gary Daniels' wife, but the mob boss's mom, or mob boss's wife, mother to all the sons who get killed off in Recoil, the Gary Daniels PM flick. So yeah, Spiro Rosatos in his great action director style, bumps off her kids one at a time in most spectacular fashion. And of course she's the one who's like yelling at the husband, being like, when is it going to stop? I'm going to lose all my sons. They're all going to die. And he's like, what do you want from me? I'm in the jail, whatever. So that's Robin Curtis. So she takes over as Savek in this film. It also wasn't a guarantee that we were going to get Nimoy back, right? And of course, we needed Nimoy for doing a sequel, right? We got to have Spock in here. And interesting, I'd read up on some of this stuff before this. Some of the interesting back and forth and things that happened. So of course, Nimoy directs this film. And what's interesting, right, is that the original director, the director of Part 2, Nicholas Meyer, I guess he didn't like the idea of Spock coming back for a sequel. In his mind, Spock dies in the second movie. And so I guess that's what I read, right? And so that's why he didn't want to be the director of this film. So Nimoy finds out, right, that they don't have a director. And he says, well, okay, if you want me back, then you've got to let me direct the film. And of course, I guess like Michael Eisner, I guess he thought that the reason why Spock was killed off in the second movie was because Nimoy didn't like playing Spock, so he wanted the character killed off, which wasn't the case. And so I guess Nimoy had a talk with him, and he, okay, all right. Well, then there was the sense of like, well, this is your first thing you're directing. Like, is it worth it to have you, is it worth it to have you direct this big thing when we're putting all this behind it? And he explained it as well. No, I know this character so well. I know this material so well. It's like, what else would you want me to be directing, right? So, so that's the idea, right? So he ends up, getting the job directing it. Now Shatner was not happy that Nimoy was getting the role as director, because it meant essentially that Nimoy was his boss. And what I had read was that there's some tension between the two of them that dated back to the original series, because the way a TV series would have been done back then is that it always would be like some big lead character and then kind of all of the ancillary characters underneath them, right? And so the lead would be the one that you'd put all the emphasis on, right? That's where all the focus would go. And I guess as the show was taking off, Nimoy's Spock character got a lot more response from fans, that people really liked his character more. And so it ended up becoming this like even kind of thing where they were kind of given even status, right? So if one of them got a contract bump, the other one got paid the same amount. And I guess it always kind of ruffled Shatner's feathers, right? That he was supposed to be the captain of the ship, he was supposed to be the head guy, and everybody liked Spock more than him, right? Which, it's an interesting phenomenon, because I don't think that ever had happened before. I mean, usually that sidekick secondary character doesn't get the kind of love that the main character did. But Spock was just such a famous, like, such a great character. I mean, he's one of the things about the Star Trek, sort of like existing in the zeitgeist. He's one of the pieces of it that is the most, right? The V with your hand, live long and prosper. The idea of a mind meld, things being logical or illogical. That's sort of, even just the idea of aliens, having pointy ears and things like that. Like, that's really kind of, that he contributed the most out of that, people from the show, and for what's in the zeitgeist. I guess the other one, Beat Me Up, Scotty, right? That's the other one that sort of exists out there. So you've got this sort of this tension here going into making this movie, and I guess when they started making it, Shatner ended up being okay with sort of that, that what Nimoy was doing as a director, he appreciated it, was okay with it. And then he was going to direct number 4, but he couldn't, due to, I don't know if it was TJ Hooker commitment or some other commitment made it so he couldn't direct number 4. And so that's why he directs 5, which of course ends up being like one of the worst in the series. But also with Nimoy doing this directing work, it starts a process of cast members directing well after this, right? I mean, it's a common thing, especially with Next Generation. I think with Next Generation, it's one area where I think there isn't that kind of jealousy, because they're all directing it, and everybody's working to direct episodes and movies and all of that kind of stuff. And so, but Nimoy is kind of the first one to really start that here with this film. So. The other thing, of course, is the casting of Christopher Lloyd as the main baddie, right? So they had this idea, right, that they were going to use Klingons as the baddies. This was really like kind of the second time that we were seeing baddies, or we were seeing, kind of the second time that we were seeing Klingons with like the head thing. It's interesting when looking up the cast list in here, right? Is that Christopher Lloyd, who is like the main baddie, you have to click on IMDb. You have to click to the next page to see him listed in there. I guess I don't know if it's because it's a order of appearance. I don't know, but like Christopher Lloyd, you think you'd want to get him up there sooner? I mean, he was a big deal at that time, with the with Taxi and all of that stuff. But anyway, so they have him playing the baddie, and there was a sense of like, do we want this guy playing a baddie, right? Because he was a goofball on Taxi, right? I mean, his character was just ridiculous. My friend Petrowski, remember, he used to do all these impressions, and he could do Christopher Lloyd from Taxi. And I remember I was playing video games at his house one time, and his mom's cousin was visiting. So his mom, dad, and mom's cousin, they were all drinking, and they called us into the room so he could do his impression, because he did all kinds of impressions. And they were like trying to get him to do Christopher Lloyd from Taxi. He's like, oh, I'm just trying to drive my cab, and I can't do it the way he could do it. He did it like a great Christopher Lloyd. So whenever we would watch this movie, if we would watch it, he would talk like. He would repeat this guy's lines doing the impression, stuff like that. So it was very interesting. But I think for Christopher Lloyd, I think for him, he liked the idea of playing a baddie. It was kind of outside of his realm, and he wanted to have fun with it. So the idea of having the Klingons and all that, it's there. Maybe I'll do a quick synopsis on the story and then kind of get into maybe sort of the legacy in my thoughts on the film. So the basic premise is that, we pick up where number 2 leaves off. So Savak and Kirk's son are on a spaceship that's kind of, a starship that's orbiting the Genesis planet, and they go down to the Genesis planet every once in a while to do stuff there. At the same time, everybody else is back in San Francisco, and Sarek, Spock's father, shows up and says to Kirk, like, hey, I imagine you've probably got my son's spirit or whatever in your brain. We got to take that in his body to back to Vulcan to do some kind of, do a ritual there. He's like, well, we left the body in Genesis. Like, well, why would you do that? And then he mind melds and realizes, like, oh, you don't have Spock's essence. It's not you. So they find out that McCoy has it. And so, the plan is to go get the body on Genesis and take the body and McCoy back to Vulcan and do this whole thing. Well, of course, Starfleet's like, no, you can't do that. And so then we get our first kind of fun adventure, right, where Shatner gets the old gang back together, and they bust McCoy out, because McCoy ends up, he tries to get a ship to Genesis himself, and he gets thrown in mental hospital, I guess, mental observation lockdown area. So they break him out. They steal the Enterprise, which is in dry dock, and they go out to go to Genesis. Unbeknownst to them, that there's this Klingon bird of prey there with Christopher Lloyd and his crew, because they want to get Genesis for themselves. I guess originally Romulans were supposed to be the baddies until they decided on Klingons. And so that's why it's a bird of prey, was that they had designed the ship and everything for the Romulans, and then thought, okay, well, maybe Romulans and Klingons, they kind of got along, and they shared technology. So they're using Romulan technology that they had gotten, from them or whatever. So then they're on the, so at the same time, Savak and Kirk's son, they recognize that there's a life form on the planet. They go down and investigate, and it's a young Spock, just a young kid, Spock, and as the planet is sort of like metamorphizing. I don't know if it's evolving very quickly. He's growing very quickly as well, and he's going through these sort of Vulcan puberty rituals that are puberty, I don't know what to describe it, but it's like it's not very fun for him going through all of this. And so so the Klingons appear at that time. Some stuff happens. David gets killed by one of the Klingons. Kirk gets his moment there. You Klingon bastards! You killed my son. Or whatever. And there's a sort of a firefight that happens, right? And of course, the Enterprise was knocked out, and so they go to the Klingons go to board. They blow. It's a kind of a whole back and forth thing. They blow up the Enterprise. It's a big scene. Watching the Enterprise blow up as they set the self-destruct so they could blow up the Klingons who invaded the ship. And then there's sort of a final fight down on the planet as it's blowing up, where Kirk defeats Christopher Lloyd. They get back on the Klingon ship and they fly off to Vulcan, where they merge Spock's body with his essence and kind of bring him back, and that's our movie. I mean, I can kind of see why people wouldn't like this one, but the way I saw it put, and the way I kind of saw it myself, watching these so quickly like this. So the last time I had seen this before I saw it here was when my friend and I tried to do that marathon. My friend Petrowski, actually, the one who does the Christopher Lloyd impressions. We were house sitting for another friend, Palos, and Palos is the one who Mike Palos has he had the collection of Star Trek movies. So he had 1 through 5 on VHS, and then the 6th one was kind of just off to the side because he bought the collection before 6 came out. But we were going to try to marathon them all overnight, and I want to say Petrowski conked out around 3 or 4, and then I got through part of 5 before I conked out myself, somewhere into 5. So might have been the last time I'd see part 3 before this. And I kind of always understood 3 when you're marathoning them as like the one you got to get through to get to 4. Though, to be honest, I wasn't as big a fan of 4 as other people were. I didn't like the whole time travel thing. So we'll get into that one in the next segment and kind of more about my feelings on that. But watching this one, I think looking back on it now, right, you just had this situation where you got in a second life with part 2, right? So part 1 comes out and it's a dud, and so you get one more chance with part 2, and it's such a hit that you get part 3, and part 3 to me feels like the don't screw it up part 3, right? It's a very safe movie. It's very safe in terms of the good guys and the bad guys and sort of the adventures that happen in it. Nothing too crazy from a story standpoint. No real messages. I guess playing God message, but nothing too out of the ordinary. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think it's not great, right? When a movie is just made as a safe movie, right? You want movies to take chances. You want movies to do things. But they wanted to just keep this thing moving in a positive direction, and that's what this does. It doesn't do anything like part 1 would do. It wasn't trying to be 2001: A Space Odyssey or anything like that. It's an interesting thing because I almost feel like nowadays you almost can't have a movie like this, right? When you're doing these franchise kinds of things, like imagine you think of the Marvels, right? Which again wasn't successful, or even the Flash movie that wasn't successful, right? And there's this sense with those movies that like they had to be bigger. They had to be bigger than anything else that year. They had to keep moving. You had to keep getting bigger, and movies had to keep getting, in those franchises, they had to keep growing. And there's something to be said for a movie that just sort of keeps the franchise alive, right? Or just keeps it, I was trying to think of the last time we had a movie like Star Trek 3 in any franchise of movies that, we're watching. I mean, I would say like in the early Marvel Cinematic Universe, right, you could maybe say that about like the Thor film, the first Thor movie, and even maybe the second Thor movie, that it's kind of like, let's just keep this thing going and not screw anything up, right? And to be honest, I think you could even say that about some of the other ones, kind of within that realm of the first couple phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, even to some extent, Ant-Man, right, is not trying to screw anything up. I'm trying to think from the DC ones, if you have a similar vibe, like maybe like Wonder Woman is kind of similar in that sense of like, let's just keep this thing going in a positive direction. But there's always this sense now that you've always got to be bigger, right? It's always got to, it can't just be as good as the first one or as similar to the first one, right? It's got to be something, 2 or 3 times bigger, right? You've got to kind of go up by powers, right? So I think that's one thing. I think that for a movie like this to sort of just keep the franchise alive and how important that was, I think that's something that was really solid there and something that I appreciated. I think that, from that sense, I think too, just the fact that it just does what you want it to do, that it's just a fun, sci-fi movie. I guess that's probably the best way to look at it. One of the other interesting things I'd read about was sort of the Gene Roddenberry aspect of this, and that I guess he'd become increasingly difficult to deal with. So I think obviously he was really difficult in the first movie, constantly pushing for rewrites and things like that. The second movie he was more sidelined, and I guess by the third movie they planned to just have him out completely, but they just had him as some sort of like executive consultant or something like that. And I guess the deal was that fans of Star Trek really wanted him involved, right? So if they'd heard that he wasn't involved, they would have been upset. Apparently, in the second movie, when word got out that Spock was being killed off, it was this massive like letter writing campaign. They were getting death threats about that, which is just. Right, which, again, like we think of that now, it's like, I guess it seems like it's actually kind of a common thing now where it's like you just, fandoms are so absurd, right, that they actually threaten to kill people based on decisions that they make for their characters, which is crazy in the sense that you think about, because there's also this massive fan fiction ecosystem, and I feel like if a movie didn't do, if I was that invested in a character that I would threaten somebody's life based on what decisions they were making with that character, I feel like the better outlet for that anger would be to just create my own fan fiction and just create like what I would want to see done with that character, and put it out there in the ether and see what people think of it. But I guess that's me, right? I'm a lover, not a fighter, I guess, right? But anyway, one of the things that Roddenberry did, and that situation with the idea of Spock being killed off, was that he would, if there were things that he didn't agree with that were being done in the movie, he would leak them to the fans to start their letter writing campaigns to put pressure to change these things. So by the third one, that's when the security gets really heightened. I had thought that the security was heightened in part because a lot of the products, a lot of the things on the set were being sold, and I guess that was part of it as well. But no, the big piece was that they didn't want this stuff getting leaked, and they didn't want it getting leaked because of these massive letter writing campaigns that would lead to death threats and all that kind of thing. So they wanted to try to keep it all under wraps, but also keep Roddenberry out of that kind of thing. I think he did leak the fact that the Enterprise was going to be blown up. So that was part of it. It's an interesting idea, blowing up the Enterprise, because there's almost a sense of, right, like that it's like a character. But on the other hand, it's like you can't just rebuild an Enterprise. Like you just build a new ship, right? It's like, I guess that's that, But I think people did treat it that way. It's like this huge end of something when it gets blown up. So yeah, so there's that there. I'm closing in on 40 minutes here, a little over 35 here on this. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I missed on this. I've kind of gone through my notes, and I think I've covered most of what's in my notes here on this one. But I think ultimately, I think for part 3, it's in terms of its quality. If you're going on that mindset of the odds are bad and the evens are good, I think it's the best of the bad odds. Maybe that's the best way to say it. I haven't seen. It'll be interesting when I see 6 again, right? Because that'll kind of give me a full on ranking of where I put these. But right now, I do kind of have it as like 2, 4, 3, and 1, right? That's sort of where I would put them. And I would think 3 would definitely be above. I can't imagine 5 like being any better than I remember, So it's really number 6 to kind of see if I put this one above 6 or not, because that would really blow the whole evens and odds thing out of the window. But I think also, again, it's never. I think it's one of those lessons that it's not good to sort of categorize these things in binaries like this of good and bad, that kind of thing. Because 3 is not it. I don't know that I would put it. I would say I think it's good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. Watching it this time around, I kind of had more appreciation for it this time around. So I don't think it's a bad movie necessarily. It's just not one of the great ones from this franchise. But I don't know if we're going to do the Next Generation ones. But I think 3 might be better than those Next Generation ones, right? That they did. The reboot ones. I've seen 2 of the 3 reboot ones. I don't know where I would put 3. Because I know I was talking with my friend Mike Palis about this, and I think we were saying that the first one was a lot of fun, with Chris Pine and all of that, and so, maybe that would be better than this movie. Probably, it probably is. Probably, I think maybe I'm stretching a little bit here, but I think its legacy as one of the odd-numbered bad movies, I think, is a little bit tougher than it deserves. I think it deserves to be. I think it's the anchor. It's the one that kind of gets you from 2 to 4, right? And this is a trilogy. This sort of like the the sort of the idea was to make this a trilogy within the series. The 2, 3, and 4 were supposed to all go together. And if 3 isn't strong enough, you don't get 4. And I think in that sense that it works well enough to kind of get you over the top to get us what number 4 is, which I think ends up being, 4 is kind of more of a favorite. So, before I forget, actually, I almost forgot to mention all of the different appearances or different people who appear in this film here. So there's a ton of names, so I'll kind of go through them. I had it on my list, and I guess I must have just completely missed it. But we have Miguel Ferrer, who is one of my favorites. Speaking of RoboCop there, RoboCop is he plays the first officer to Captain Styles, who's played by James Sicking. And so James Sicking, I can't remember. I want to say he was the dad on Doogie Howser. He was something like that. I mean, he played all kinds of parts, right? He did a bunch of things. I mean, Hill Street Blues, I guess, was another one that everybody would have known him for. So I mean, he did plenty of stuff. But Doogie Howser, I think, is the one that I knew him from, and I can't remember if he was Doogie's dad or just like another. I guess he was the dad. He was the dad. David Hauser. That would make him the dad. So okay. So yeah. So we got him as the other captain. Let's see. We got John Larroquette plays a Klingon, which is absolutely fantastic. I want to say he's the one who when the crew Kirk and company, when they board the Klingon ship and they take it over, he's there and he's like, I don't deserve to live, and Kirk's like, no, you got to live because we need you to help us fly this plane. So that was John Larroquette. Also, Branscombe Richmond, DTVC favorite of ours. He plays a Klingon gunner in this. So always great to see him and have him in there. I was trying to think, do I have anybody else? I was trying to think if there's anybody else, and I feel like there's somebody I'm missing here, but I'm not sure. I mean, we get, of course, we've got Grace Lee Whitney. She plays Woman in the Cafeteria, but we know her from the original series. They were able to get her in the film. So you see those kinds of names in here as well. But I mean, Miguel Ferrer is one of my personal favorites. So seeing him, that was just I always love seeing him and stuff. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. One of my favorite actors, and so always good to see him there. Well, I think that covers us there. I think we're good on this one now. We can officially put this one to bed. So I'm going to stop this one here, and then when we get back, we will look at number 4, The Voyage Home. It's the early 90s in LA. The war on drugs is raging, and Detective John Bainbridge is the LAPD's secret weapon against crime. Former Special Forces in Nam, he's a cop on the edge. When he and his partner Geary uncover a potential human trafficking ring, it doesn't take long before John Bainbridge realizes this thing goes all the way to the top, which doesn't scare him. That just means they'll fall that much harder when he takes them down. Part send-up and part love letter to early 90s action films, Bainbridge will take you back to the golden days of Canon, PM Entertainment, and AIP. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited from Amazon. Follow the link in the podcast description. My newest novel, Don's House in the Mountains, is available now. It follows Don Veazey, who after 20 years has finally made it as a writer, going from an AP English teacher to richer and more famous than he ever could have imagined. In the process, his wife Lois, feeling alienated and resentful of her husband's success, has filed for divorce, forcing Don to move to a house in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. With time alone to reflect, he's able to see how his new wealth and fame has affected his life in ways he never expected. Maybe the biggest of these is his new house, which is bigger and nicer than anything he's ever had in his entire life, but the longer he lives there, the more he gets the sense that it might have magical powers. But that can't be right. A house can't have magical powers, can it? Pick up Don's House in the Mountains today. You can find it at Amazon in paperback and in Kindle. All right, we are back, and now we're going to start looking at Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. And so this movie comes out in 1986. So I actually remember this one coming out in the theater. So it's the first of the Star Trek ones that I actually remember being advertised and all of that. So in my head, I actually thought it came out later because of that, because I remembered the commercials and all of that. Because I remember Spock giving the punk the Vulcan death grip, right? Vulcan Death Pinch or whatever it's called on the bus, right? Like that was just in the theater, in the commercials. I didn't see it in the theater. I did see it later. I think the first one I saw in the theater was number 6 in 1991. So I didn't see it in the theater, but I do remember it coming out. Interesting when you think of Paramount. We were just talking about how Paramount sort of has these different. They're kind of were making money off of different things at that time. It is interesting if you look at the years that Star Trek movies come out. They tend to be like the most successful distributor in those years, right? So 82, we get Wrath of Khan. And in that year, they had 3. So they had 2 other movies that were top 10 grossers, right? They had Officer and a Gentleman and 48 Hours. They were the only distributor that had 3 in the top 10 that year. And then 84, when Part 3 comes out, they had 3 other movies, right? They had Beverly Hills Cop, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and Footloose. And they were the only distributor that had that many, right? That had 4. There's some other ones that had multiple ones, but nobody else had 4 that year. And then, you get into 1986 when this comes out. In 1986 they had, this movie. I think they had 5 for that year. So you have, Top Gun, Crocodile Dundee, and then The Golden Child. Which, interesting about The Golden Child is that they're originally going to have Eddie Murphy star in this in the role that Catherine Hicks takes. He was going to play that part. And then he didn't really like the idea of playing that part. He is like, if he wanted to be in the movie, he didn't want to be a scientist. So he ends up doing The Golden Child anyway, which is a big one. And of course, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? They had that one in '86 as well. So another big year for them. Actually, though, as I think about it, '85 was an off year for them. I think the only one they had was in the top 10 that year was Witness, which, it's just the idea of a Witness being a top 10 grossing film for a year, right? Does seem kind of crazy. It's just. Yeah, I mean, when you look at some of the other ones that were big, like they make sense. Like Back to the Future makes sense as the #1 grossing movie that year. Rambo, Rocky, those make sense. Even Color Purple, kind of makes sense. But Witness, right? You're just like, Witness. That was but that's what movies were like in the '80s, right? Was that you could have a Witness be in a top 10 grossing film that year. I mean, I think '89, Dead Poet Society is a top 10 grossing movie. The industry was much more diverse. I mean, it was still very corporate, right? It was still really concerned about making money, but I think from a movie taste standpoint, we as film goers, we movies were really what you had back then. Even in the '80s, the VCR is out, but it's still kind of an expensive thing, and movies were not released as soon as you'd think on VHS. It's part of the reason why the direct-to-video world grows in the '80s, because you had a window where if a movie was in the theater, you could put out your DTV version of it as a kind of a similar type version and be able to take advantage of that. So of course we think of it like a lot with ninja movies, but like with Rambo movies, it's like, okay, so Rambo First Blood Part 2 would come out in '85. I don't know when it would have been on VHS. Probably not before 1986, right? It would have been a little while before it's on there. So in that window, right, you can just get Sirio 8 Santiago and any number of Italian directors out to the Philippines and just shoot a whole bunch of these movies and then throw them in the video store and kind of grow that way, because people would go see them that way. But anyway, newer movies, right? I mean, it would take a while for them to even get to like HBO or something like that if you had HBO, which not many people I knew had HBO even. So it made for a much more diverse movie. It made for a much more diverse experience when it came to going to the theater. And so that's where you get a Witness. That's Paramount's only top 10 film, of 1985. But actually, 1983 was a good year for them as well. They had 4 in the top 10. Interesting, again, when you look at their I mean, obviously, Return of the Jedi killed everything that year in '83. I was 4 then. I don't remember like Return of the Jedi necessarily being in the theater. I wouldn't have known, I think, necessarily what that meant at 4. But I remember like the stuff. Like I remember my mom used to, because my mom was a nurse and she worked the 3 to 11 shift, so she would have been around in the mornings to see kids off to school. So I remember there's a kid who I don't know if he lived up the street or like his grandmother lived up the street or whatever. But my mom, he would hang out at our house, and then my mom would make sure he got to the bus okay in the morning. And I had like my dad's old Pigs in Space lunchbox. That's what I took to nursery school. And he had a Return of the Jedi one. And he let me trade for a day. And I remember bringing that in and just like, it's just like this, it's this plastic, like bright red with the picture of, I want to say it was the picture of Luke lifting the ship with Yoda. I think that was the picture that was on I can't remember exactly. I just remember the bright red. Of course, now I look back on it. I mean, that Pigs in Space lunchbox was much cooler now, right? If I saw the 2 now, it'd be like that pig. But at that time, I was like, oh, Pigs in Space, whatever. But Return of the Jedi, that's awesome. So I remember that kind of, But I mean, Paramount with Terms of Endearment, Flashdance, and Trading Places, which of course here in Philadelphia, right? Trading Places, you gotta love that one. And then Staying Alive, the sequel to Saturday Night Fever, even that one did well, which we think of that movie as not being that good. But I mean, again, you just look at some of the movies that were also there. I mean, Risky Business is there. Mr. Mom. It's a different. Of course, you have Octopussy, right? You've got a James Bond movie, which at that time United Artists were doing those movies, which United Artists they're kind of like the A&M Records, right, of the movie industry. They hadn't been bought out by MGM yet. So that's another thing too, is you see other names, for movies. I mean, when you look at the 1986 list, you see Orion, right? Platoon. Orion, Platoon was their movie, and of course that one swept the Oscars. Between that and Hannah and Her Sisters, right? Which I don't know. I don't know who distributed Hannah and Her Sisters. That would have, I don't know with Woody Allen's movies. I don't know how that worked for his. And of course, yeah, I mean, you would definitely not get a Woody Allen movie today that's like, I mean, if you think of what 77, Annie Hall was a top 10 grossing movie, right? So, oh yes, Hannah and Her Sisters was Orion as well. I didn't even think of that. It was Orion, So I always think of the joke in Mitchell, right? If you've ever seen that one where there's a scene in Mitchell where Joe Don Baker is with John Saxon, and John Saxon's like fancy like den area where he's got all his Christmas presents set up and all of that stuff, and he's like trying to work out some kind of bribe that's like essentially him buying a company, and then the company gets sold and he gets all this money from the selling of the company. And so he's like, I start a company for like $100, and now one of the Joel or one of the bots says, we'll call it Orion, right? Because at that point Orion had gone under, but at the time, right, Orion was a big. I mean, RoboCop is probably the big Orion one that you think of, right? But yeah, I mean, again, like Orion, I mean, it'd be like Lionsgate having a top 10 film, now, like you wouldn't see that kind of thing. So, and of course, again, a platoon or not platoon, a platoon making, being a number third grossing film and also sweeping the Oscars would be a big deal as well. So yeah, 1986 is an interesting year, right, for movies. And of course, Star Trek is kind of still chugging along here, right? They do well enough. Part 3 was, top 10 grossing film for the year that it came out in 1984. So, 1986, this one was greenlit. The idea behind the time travel, I'd read a few different ideas about this, but I guess, one was that they had wanted to do a time travel. And Roddenberry, originally, he wanted the first movie to be a time travel thing where they go back in time and prevent the assassination of JFK. And I think one of the reasons why they didn't want to do that was because they didn't want anything that would change the fabric of our time, right? They wanted our time to kind of stay as it was. So then there was this idea that, like, because of the rainforest at the time, that was a big issue, right? You think of Save the Rainforest, right? And of course, we don't talk about that much anymore. So in Brazil, they're still carving up tons of rainforests and growing a bunch of beef there. So if you go to McDonald's, you're eating rainforest beef probably. So it's still kind of a thing, right? But we don't talk about it as much anymore. But there was a time when it was like save the rainforest, right? That was everywhere, and the idea was supposed to be that there was like some sort of virus that's killing off the planet, and the crew goes back in time to where the rainforest would have been, or where the rainforest is, and collect whatever it is that they need to collect to save the planet. They looked at that and thought that would be way too dark of an idea, which I totally get, right? People dying in plagues is not fun, right? It's not a fun thing. So they definitely, I think they made a right choice there, not going with that. So then it's like, okay, well, what do we do? And then there was the idea of whaling, right? Because I think at that time it was really big in the news. I think the international whaling community, they put like a moratorium on whaling. There were only a few countries that still did it. I think that still do even. I think it's like Japan and maybe Norway and Iceland. I think in Iceland, those are the ones. Because I think Bourdain in the first episode of No Reservations, he goes to Iceland and he eats some kind of fermented whale thing. It's like one of the few things on the show that he didn't like, that he wasn't a fan of. But anyway, so that's Iceland with whaling. But the idea is that, like, okay, let's do something with whales. And then they come up with this idea that, okay, what if there's like this alien being that's coming out to talk to whales, right? Because every time aliens come to Earth, right, they want to talk to humans. They want to know about humans or learn about humans. What if it's some other, being, and the idea of whales at that time, I think we were still trying to understand, the whale songs, but we had a sense that they were more sentient, than maybe previously thought. So there was that idea as well. So that's where they kind of come up with this idea for what the time travel movie was going to be. And, again, I think when I'd seen this a couple times. I remember one time recently seeing it, and that's not really that recent anymore. It was when the casinos opened in Connecticut here in the United States, one of my friends played poker. My friend John, he played poker for a living. I think he was trying to make it as a journalist, and he was making money playing poker and realized like, oh, this is actually good money that I'm making here doing this. And then his brother Jesse was in my class. We were the same age, and so we were friends as well. And so Jesse enjoyed like kind of playing blackjack and things like that while his brother was playing cards. And they invited me to come with them. So I played horses. That's kind of what I did. So but I remember we were in the hotel. We got a hotel outside of where the casino was to save money. And we're sitting in the hotel and Star Trek 4 was on. And there's that scene where they go back in time, right? Where they zip the plane around not the plane, the Vulcan bird of prey. They zip it around the sun. And as they're going around, right, there's that whole thing of like these like gray like plaster molds of them that are like emerging from like whatever, and they're making all these faces, and we were all just cracking up. Like we couldn't, we just thought it was hilarious. And when I watched it again this time, I started cracking up again. It was still funny. I mean, I don't know what made them decide to put that in there or what that idea was, but anyway. So why don't I get in? We'll do a basic synopsis in here, and then we'll kind of get down to it and talk about Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. So the idea is, again, we're picking up where the last movie left off. Kirk and his crew are wanted individuals for the crimes that they committed against the Federation in rescuing Spock's body and all that jazz. So they are now fugitives from the law, flying this Vulcan bird of prey. They're on Vulcan. Klingon bird of prey. They're on Vulcan. Spock is kind of getting his brain back in order from everything that's happened. Scotty is fixing up the ship, and Savek is there. And of course, because if you're going back in time and you're going to be in modern, United States, you can't have two Vulcans on the ship at once. So Savek stays behind on Vulcan while they all go off. And their plan is they're going to go to Earth and surrender, turn themselves in, and face whatever punishment that they're going to get. Same time, the Klingons are there. There's a Klingon ambassador there who is he's played by a character actor, and John Schuck. So if you've ever watched a TV show that took place in the 70s, you'd know who John Schuck is. So he plays the Klingon ambassador, who's essentially saying like, this Kirk guy's horrible. He should be, he should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. So, it was kind of great seeing him there. And so after that, as they're on their way back to the planet Earth to face their Federation punishment, at the same time, this massive probe is kind of floating through space, making these weird garbled noises. And every time it encounters something, it knocks out all the power to it. And so it's knocking out ships. One of the things we get here, we get the first African American female captain actually in this sequence here when this is all happening. As I'm trying to think if I thought I had her name down, and of course it's always, I always rely on IMDb to pull these names. I'm like, okay, I'll just grab them from IMDb, but they don't list things in ways that you're always expecting. So it's never always as good as you want it to be. But anyway, sort of the captain of the Saratoga, and I think there's something about her because the actress. She is actually, I think she plays Geordi LaForge's mom in an episode. And so there's an idea that maybe this character in the movie is somehow related to Geordi LaForge. So the actress name is Madge something, I think. And so, of course, it's like one of those names. It's like, we're just not going to put her anywhere near the top of the list. Madge Sinclair, that's the actress's name. So, she's third from the bottom here. She's uncredited as the Saratoga captain because why wouldn't she be? It's weird that they can do that, right? Because nowadays I don't think I don't think people that have speaking parts are uncredited in movies, I guess, or I don't know, maybe it's a SAG thing or something like that. But but I think that's the first time we have an African American female as a captain of a starship is in that situation. But of course her ship is being taken out, right? It's the power is being knocked out on that ship. We're seeing it with not just ships, but we're seeing it with space stations, all that kind of stuff. And this thing finally makes it to Earth, and it's like just sort of like ripping apart the oceans and like tearing up stuff, and Starfleet, they're freaking out, things are blowing up, glass is breaking, all that kind of stuff. And then the our heroes and their Klingon bird of prey show up, and they realize like what's happening. And then a few things, once they realize it has to do with the water, Kirk has Uhura take the sound and run it through like the idea of like if it's underwater with salt water too, it's some sort of concoction. And then with the sound there, Spock, of course, recognizes that this is humpback whale sounds, which, of course, he's heard in a database somewhere. And so, unfortunately, humpback whales went extinct in the 20th century, which is something that fortunately didn't happen. I know they were hunted to the brink of extinction, but now they're in the category of least concern in terms of their conservation status. I think the numbers have recovered to I guess there's 135,000 worldwide, but in the 60s it was down to 5,000, and so their numbers have really shrunk at that point. So yeah, I mean, I guess there are still issues. One of them is fishing gear, which is interesting. My dad was talking about this with in lobster fishing in Maine, that you have to have your cords, the cords that connect the buoy to the trap below. They have to be colored a certain way so that if you do get hung up on a whale, or if it does get hung up on a whale, they can track whose it was, and all kinds of issues there. I feel like that's an issue for northern Maine, and certainly my dad, where they live, it's very southern tip of Maine. We don't really have whales down there that I know of, or maybe in the Massachusetts area. But yeah, I guess that is a concern, is that humpback whales getting caught in fishing lines. I didn't realize that. And of course, I guess noise pollution is another one. I don't know what that is, submarines making too much noise. But anyway, they're no longer on the brink of extinction. But I think when the movie was made at that time, that was a huge concern. That's why why there was a moratorium on whaling, and that kind of thing. I mean, I don't think there's anything, unless you're a huge fan of whale meat, I don't think there's anything else that we get from whales that we can't make synthetically now. I don't think there's any reason to hunt whales. But anyway, this movie at that time was thinking the idea that, yeah, we hunted whales to extinction, and now they needed to go back in the past and save a couple. So, our heroes are in San Francisco in 1986. They find out that there's two humpback whales, George and Gracie, right? Thinking of George Allen and George and Gracie Allen, right? Or George Burns and Gracie Allen. Sorry, George Burns and Gracie from the old Gracie and Allen show. I remember watching that show. Was it the George Burns show or the George? I can't remember what it was called, but I always loved it. One of the retro channels would have it, and so it was this kind of thing where George Burns was this straight man who'd walk around smoking cigars, and then Gracie was doing all kinds of goofy stuff, and then he had these neighbors, and he had a son that would do goofy stuff too, and he would sometimes he would watch on a TV camera, a TV screen. He would watch the happenings and stuff. But the thing is, right, he would always arch his eyebrow the way that Spock arches his eyebrow, right, when things happen, and so that's why they used George and Gracie as the name for the whales, right? As kind of an homage to that part of Spock. But anyway, Catherine Hicks, she's running an aquarium, and they have two humpback whales in captivity, which of course has never happened before. Really never would happen, right? They're just too big to keep in captivity. But the idea is that they somehow washed along shore, and before they can let them free, they've got them there. So hey, this is perfect, right? The team can get this humpback whale, these humpback whales, bring them back to the current time in the 23rd century, 24th century, whatever it is. But yes, 300 years in the future, right? So it would have been the 23rd century. They can bring them out to the 23rd century, save the day, right? That's really what it is. Because the idea is that this probe, nobody can respond to the probe because it's the sounds are humpback whale sounds, and nobody knows how to speak humpback whale other than humpback whales. So the team breaks off into three groups, right? So you've got Kirk and Spock, who go to find the whales. And then you've got McCoy and Scotty, who go to find the containers that they can put in the the Klingon vertebrae so they can house the whales, right? Actually, I guess, yeah, there's three teams. I guess Sulu's kind of part of that team, but kind of not, because he's going to get on his own to get a helicopter. And then Uhura and Chekhov, they need to get radiation because Spock thinks that they can rebuild the dilithium crystals that burnt out when they went back in time. He thinks he can use radiation to nuclear fission or something to rebuild them. And there's a nuclear-powered submarine in Alameda Bay, right? So that's the plan to go there. So they all kind of break off and go do their thing. So Kirk and Spock, they go to the aquarium. They meet Catherine Hicks. In a really hilarious scene, right? Spock goes through the water and goes into the tank and is mind melding with the humpback whale. And then you've got Scotty and McCoy talking to a guy who runs a fiberglass plant on showing him how to make transparent aluminum, and saying, hey, if I give you the patent for this, you can, will you give us all the stuff we need for free? Great, okay. And then Chekhov and Uhura, they find their way, to Alameda Bay. They've located where the crystal, where the radiation is, or where I don't know, whatever the nuclear fission stuff is. So everything's taken care of. So Catherine Hicks, of course, is suspicious of these guys, but also she knows bad things are going to happen to these whales, and so it's almost like this Kirk guy is like my one chance. It's almost like a Hail Mary thing, and so she ends up trusting them, and so they're kind of okay. This is going to work out for that part of it. They get the aluminum, the transparent aluminum, put into the ship, so that's all ready to go. But then, unfortunately, the radiation that they're collecting from the naval ship, it's causing an issue with the transporter, and so Chekhov can't get beamed off. So he's captured by these like sort of Secret Service agents on the Navy base, and they're questioning him. He tries to escape, and he falls and maybe breaks his neck, breaks his head, or whatever. So they've got to get him out. They've got to rescue him. So they go to rescue him, and then while they're in the process of rescuing him, they realize that the whales have already been taken. They're already in like Alaska or something. The reason why the whales were taken to Alaska is because the mayor at that time, and I'm drawing a blank on her name. She's a Senator Dianne Feinstein. Who's famous U.S. senator from California who served well past the time that she should have been serving. She was like in her 90s, and she was like in rough shape. But she was mayor, like for example, when Harvey Milk was assassinated, she was mayor at that time. I think she may have even been hit by a bullet. I can't remember, but so that's so she'd been mayor. So it kind of gives you a sense of the time frame, right? That when you're looking at the late 80s, and she would have been in the mid to late 70s, as through that period as mayor. But anyway, so she said, no, you can't, with the Golden Gate Bridge and all the stuff that we got to deal with there, you can't be doing all the whale saving there. So they do it, they move the stuff to Alaska, and they do it at a different location. But anyway, so they're able to get the whales on the ship, go back in time, and everything, the whales get in the water, and they send the signal back up to the probe that's destroying everything, and the probe's like, okay, everything's good here, we'll hit the road. I guess the idea is that the probe was going through space for 300 years because that was the last time it would have heard the signal from the humpback whales. I guess that was the issue, and so so that was the thing. But yeah, that's the movie, and as I'm watching it, I'm like, wow, I'm having a lot of fun with this movie, and I don't know why the younger me didn't have as much fun with it as the older me. It's kind of a weird thing, right? You think younger me would have fun with that kind of thing too, but I was just having a lot more fun with it this time around, which kind of firmly cements it as my number 2 now, right after the second movie. It hit all the beats that we expected of these Marvel movies now, right? When you think of like the Marvel movies where it's sort of like this kind of adventure romp thing. I mean, in a way, right? Endgame takes a lot from this movie when they're going back to collect the Infinity Stones, right? It plays out in a very similar way to this movie, where you've got the different teams going back in time and doing different things. So there's that part of it there too, and I think sometimes that's always just enough, right? I think I care about the characters. The movie made me care about the characters and want to have fun with them. I mean, at the end of the movie, when the Vulcan, or I keep calling it a Vulcan, the Klingon bird of prey is in San Francisco Bay, kind of floating around, and the humpback whales are floating out to sea, and they're splashing and doing that kind of thing. And then the crew starts splashing in the water as well, and they're having a good time with it. It's just like, it's so much like a fun ending to that movie. And the little adventures that they go on are fun too. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of danger involved, but it also hits the same beats, right? The whole like, okay, we've got everything set. Oh no, this one, problem happens that they've got to, no, it looks like all hope is lost. Are they going to get there in time? Are they going to save the whales in time? All these bad things are happening, and they're able to just manage and just be able to pull it off and just do it. It all hits those spots like that, but it just seems so much fun, right, with those characters. I think one of the things why I would like this one better than Endgame, right, is that I've been hanging out with these characters even longer than the Endgame characters. I'm sure I like Robert Downey Jr., but everybody else, are they as much fun as Kirk and Spock and Sulu and company? Yeah, no, this is like a much more fun deal, right, watching this crew. The other thing too, of course, that Star Trek 4 has that Endgame doesn't have, or sorry, wrong way around. The thing that Endgame has that Star Trek doesn't have is random people dying for no reason, right? It's like, oh, we've got to kill off Black Widow. Why do we have to kill off Black Widow? What? Because she's one of 2 like stronger female characters, and we killed off the other stronger female character in the previous movie? That's why we had to kill them off? Like, what is the point of that? Star Trek's like, no, we're not killing anybody off. everybody's going to make it back in time. Everybody's coming back, right? Everybody's going to survive. We're gonna save Chekhov. Nobody's dying here. I think it might be one of the only ones where no one dies, whether it's the cast or crew or anybody, right? I think it might be the only one out of all the 6 where nobody dies at some point. So yeah, good, and it's a lot of fun as a result of that. Yeah, I mean, some of the other things about this one, of course, Nimoy directs this one. I believe the reason why, again, was it because Shatner was doing he was doing T.J. Hooker at that time, which is, again, just seems weird because T.J. Hooker seems like it was much further in the past, but I guess not, right? When you think about when they would have been filming this one to get it there, when T.J. Hooker would have been. It's funny when you look at his IMDb bio, it's all Star Trek movies, right? So they don't list T.J. Hooker. I mean, T.J. Hooker, right? When I think of that show, it's somewhat for Kirk, but I think also Heather Locklear, right? As a kid, we always loved Heather Locklear on that show. So she was. Oh, I think that was like so yeah. So the show went from 82 to 86. Yeah, so it was filming. He couldn't direct this and do that at the same time, and so so he missed out. So he ends up directing part 5 as a result because of that. But yeah, and the other thing, of course, too, if you remember, is that he did Saturday Night Live to promote this movie, and that was when the infamous "Why don't you people get a life?" Sketch happened, right? So if you remember, Kirk is at a convention, and you've got like John Lovitz, and I mean that cast, that late '80s cast is one of my favorites. Kind of that late '80s into the early '90s cast, with Lovitz and Dana Carvey and Jan Hooks and Phil Hartman. I mean, they were always had great sketch ideas, and so that was one that I always really loved. But if the other one in that episode that people don't talk about enough is when they make fun of T.J. Hooker, where he spends the entire episode like hanging on the front of a hood of a car, right? And he's like, like talking to people and calling it and stuff like that, which that was another funny sketch. But there was a sense with that sketch that Star Trek fans thought that he was saying he didn't like them or he didn't like the part or anything like that. But I think it was more done in jest. I think he's always appreciated the Kirk character. I think like all of these actors, right? It's one of those things where it's like they wanted more for their careers than just Star Trek. And I was trying to think out all of them, like who, obviously Patrick Stewart, right? Because he comes in and does the X-Men franchise, so he might have been out of everybody maybe the most successful. I'm trying to think of anybody else, like, kind of big part, right, on one of the series and parlay that into something just as big, if not bigger. I mean, yeah, the X-Men franchise thing. But again, Patrick Stewart was kind of a name before he went on to Star Trek. So there's that part too. But so I think that there's that part of it of like, can I get out from underneath this thing? I mean, one of the funny things with him is so he does the last 2 Trek movies, right, in the late 80s, early 90s, right? So he does Final Frontier 3 years after this in 89, and then Undiscovered Country in 91. And then he starts writing the Tech War books. And I guess I didn't know at the time that he wrote those with somebody else. I didn't realize that they were like, that somebody co-wrote them with him. But I remember reading those as a kid. I thought they were hilarious. I don't know if hilarious is the right word, but I always had a lot of fun with them. I could read them in a day, So I'd get them at the bookstore. And then in the early 90s, they made USA made movie versions of them. So you had like Tech Lords and Tech Lab and Tech Tech Justice and all that kind of stuff. And so he was kind of doing those, right? That was kind of his thing. He was making those movies through USA based off his books. He wasn't the main character. The main character was played by Greg Evigan. He was playing like kind of like this like. Because Greg Evigan is like he's like this character who's like Greg Evigan, the main character that Greg Evigan played. He's like this guy who gets in trouble with the law, spends some time like frozen or whatever, and comes back, and then like because he can't be a police officer anymore. This Walter Bascom guy who runs like a private detective agency, who's like a rich guy. He hires him to solve crimes for him, and Shatner plays that Bascom character. So yeah, so like they kind of roll into each other. That we've got like the Star Trek stuff sort of ending or kind of wrapping up, and then this Tech War stuff, and then of course he finishes everything off with Generations in '94, which even we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of Generations as well, which is kind of crazy to think. But yeah, this was the movie, right? That it was that Saturday Night Live was the infamous "Why don't you guys get a life?" or "Why don't you people get a life?" that kind of started this idea that there was some kind of love-hate thing with Star Trek that I don't know was necessarily there. I think he always appreciated Star Trek for that reason. But anyway, so you have that. I mean, the other thing, of course, is this is Nimoy's second one that he directed, and again, it's a lot of fun, and I think the idea to do one that was more fun, I think, was a smart play on their part. I think this works so well in that sense. I think knowing that you had these actors and knowing how much everybody loved them, putting them in a spot like this was such a smart move. And I think it's something I don't know what I didn't appreciate. I mean, I didn't like the time travel thing. I thought the time travel thing was weird. I guess that part of it was just too much for me. And I don't know, I wasn't a fan of all of it, as a result. Now maybe I'm just like a little bit less concerned with that kind of thing. It's like, whatever. They go back in time, they do something, they come back to the present in the 23rd century, and it's all over. But yeah, I mean, it was a fun ending too, to sort of the way this this trilogy within the series was. And I don't know if there was a sense like they knew after number 4 they were going to make a number 5. I feel like they probably felt like they had to, because Kirk needed to direct something, right? So they were going to. But the 5th one doesn't follow. It's not within the strict story arc of these. I mean, it follows the other 4, but it's not so much like part of this little arc that we have here. So it'll be interesting when we kind of move forward and go into to 5 and 6 and kind of see how those play out from a story standpoint. One of the other things about this movie is that there was an original idea to have it be Kirk on trial and almost being tried by the Klingons. And if that had happened, I think what they ended up doing was taking bits of that stuff and putting it in number 6. So when the Klingons come back, there's kind of more of that there. I mean, the other interesting thing, of course, too, is that the Klingons, when we get into Star Trek: The Next Generation, there's a truce between the Klingons and the Federation, and they're kind of getting along better at that point. And of course, we have Worf, who's a Klingon, who's part of the crew and all of that. So it's a kind of a different vibe with them later on. But that was one of the thoughts they had for this movie. But again, I think they made the right decisions here with the things that they did with it. I think it's just it's a fun adventure up, and I think the way so many, like especially of the Marvel ones that were successful, were kind of those fun adventure romps. The fact that that it kind of, a movie like this was kind of an earlier version of that. I mean, the other thing too, right, is that you're seeing more adventure romps successful in the 80s, right? So, I mean, of course, the biggest one was the Indiana Jones series, right? Of course, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I mean, that was an interesting one in the sense that, like, it inverted the pyramid, or not the pyramid, I don't know if it's the sine wave or however you want to look at it, but it inverts the normal movie sort of pacing, right? Usually it's like large periods of inaction with these big action moments and then go back to the inaction. Indiana Jones is almost like constant action throughout, right? It's constant adventure, constant things happening. And movies hadn't really done that before. And, again, this one follows a little bit more of that paradigm where there's not a lot that's, anytime there's like kind of a period of things not happening, there's like sort of this more fun, like jokey interplay that's going on when things aren't happening. So again, it's like you're kind of just always having fun at all times in the movie, which I think is important, right? There's no like serious plot exposition or anything like that that's weighing the film down. It's just constantly moving on that level. But I think like part 3 does not have this kind of fun adventure vibe to it, right? Another one that comes out, right, 1985, you get Back to the Future. So that's another one that kind of furthers this sort of this romp adventure style of movie. And so this movie fits in with that kind of feeling more than the way than it does with the other 2 movies, right? Where the other 2 movies are, I think obviously part 2 is more of like a space war, space battle kind of movie. And then part 3 is just something in between. It's just, it's more of another kind of a battle, and it's almost like a continuation of how part 2 was. It just didn't land the way that part 2 did, because it didn't, I think that the characters involved weren't as good. I mean, I liked Christopher Lloyd as the Klingon, but it's not quite the same thing. So they come back with this one, and not have it be like a villain, right? Because there is no real villain in this. Like it's almost like part 1, right, with the V'ger thing. This probe that's destroying everything is not exactly a villain. We don't know exactly what this is, but it's not like a Klingon. It's not like Khan or something like that. It's just some other thing. but again, it's this cosmic thing that needs to be defeated, and our team comes together and does it. So it's a another great fun kind of moment there that we have with that. So yeah, I think for modern movie watchers, this is probably the closest. This is probably the one that they would recognize the most in terms of like the way the beats were in this. Like it feels the most like a Marvel movie or something like that. What's interesting though, I think, what makes this unique, different from what we think of with these Marvel movies is that often these Marvel movies, they either have an unlimited budget, right? The money's no object, or if there are budget limitations, there's still a pretty high ceiling, right, for what they can do. I mean, with this movie, we're still in a mode where, again, Star Trek is not the biggest moneymaker for Paramount, and so they're not given an unlimited budget. They have to make decisions based on their budget. So one of them, for example, is the decision to set this in 1986 and not like maybe another time way in the past or another time, because if they set it in 1986, they can use modern exterior shots. They can use modern clothing, all of those kinds of things. They don't need to worry so much about those setting up sets and sort of setting it in a different period piece. So again, they're still having to make decisions based off of the budget that sometimes these Marvel movies don't have to make. Which again, I mean, it makes you kind of wonder when you think of like again with the Marvels, going back to the Marvels, which had a huge budget. Would that have been better, perhaps, if it had to make decisions based off of trying to stay within? I mean, again, I don't know what the budget. I mean, I don't know what a comparable budget would be compared to what this was. I mean, I think they were working on much lower budgets than what you would think of for blockbusters, at that time. So the budget was $25 million. Yeah. So I mean, you'd be talking, we're talking about like a $50 million budget today. So what if we called it 80 or 75, right? If you tell the Marvels that they've got to stay within that number, right? Maybe you get something that's a little bit more, I mean, not that I didn't like the Marvels. I enjoyed the Marvels, but I'm just saying, like, in terms of like, maybe having those constraints in some ways help. It'd be nice if you could always just make a movie based on, what your vision is and you don't have to worry about a budget. But sometimes I think the budget does help with these, because I don't know if this movie would have worked if it was set in a different time. So it's one of the areas of the film that I like there. Interesting thing when you watch this, right, is that this movie is very anti-whaling, right? The message that you get throughout the film is that whaling is dumb. It's as Spock says when they're getting the tour to Catherine Hicks, hunting a species to extinction is illogical. And Catherine Hicks says, well, who said humans are logical? So it definitely has that vibe. But apparently, according to Leonard Nimoy, there were protests because people thought they were using real whales to shoot the footage, which they weren't, right? They were either using animatronics or they were using, footage that was already captured of like whales jumping in the air, stuff like that. So, it's so it's interesting, right? That you never know, like what you think you're helping, and I don't know how much this movie helped. I mean, I think there was a lot of momentum at that time to stop whaling already before that time. So I don't know how much this movie furthered it. But I mean, the fact that we are at a place where humpback whales aren't being extinct, so that in the Star Trek show timeline, yes, we killed them off. But it's like McCoy said, I don't know how these people got out of the 20th century, and we did make it out of the 20th, but I don't know how we'll make it out of the 21st, right? We'll see what happens. Maybe McCoy is right there, right? He doesn't know how we'll make it out of these different ones. But one other last thing I want to mention is, of course, is that this movie is dedicated to the shuttle, the Challenger that blew up in 1986. And so this is something people my age, I think it's almost all of us in my age, we saw that shuttle blow up in school. So you're in school, and it's one of those deals where they wheel in the TV on the cart, and you stop everything. And it was as a kid, it's fun because you don't have to do class stuff, right? You get to watch this, and especially where I lived, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher who was on the shuttle, she is from nearby in Exeter, New Hampshire, nearby where I grew up. So that was also like a local person who was on the ship. So we were all excited. We're all gearing up to watch this thing, and then the shuttle blew up. And it was one of those things where I think for me, as a kid watching action movies and stuff like that, I didn't understand right away what it was. And I don't think my teachers understood what to do with it, right? I mean, I was trying to think. So 86, I think I would have been in third grade. So of course that teacher was older. So she would have, I want to say, like, I remember her, she had her, was it her grandmother was still with us, who was in her 90s. So she would have been in like her 60s, I guess, 60s or 70s. So she would have been born in the 20s. She would have been World War II generation. That's probably the best way to think of it. Yeah. No, her grandmother in her 90s. So maybe it wasn't her grandmother. Maybe it was because she was definitely older, the teacher. But anyway, I'm going off track here. The point is, like, she didn't know what to do. Nobody really knew how to manage this, right? Like, you're a teacher in a class and you don't know. How do you explain to these kids that everybody just died, right? That you just saw all of these people die on TV, and it's one of those things that I think all of us still remember it, right? Like, it was a huge, strong moment. And what's interesting from the Star Trek standpoint that I didn't know until reading some of the trivia and background on this film is that Uhura was used by NASA to sort of grow sort of STEM candidates within, from women and minority communities. So, to that point, it was all white men, right? And of course, you think about the moon landing and all of that stuff. It's all white men who were doing that, and they wanted it to be more diverse. They wanted more people going up into space. And she was the one who was the face of that and who was helping to recruit people. And so I think like half of the crew that blew up on the Challenger were people that she had personally, had a part in getting into being astronauts and that kind of thing, which is really sad to hear. But at the same time, it was something I didn't know that she was doing that. So it's part of her legacy that was much bigger, right? That the diversity that we see in people pursuing careers in science and in aviation. And going into space as well, she played a huge part now, something I didn't realize. But, again, they dedicate the film to the people who died on the Challenger. And it's one of those reminders, for me, of course, seeing it in there, I'm like, oh, that's right, 1986, that's when this happened. I mean, in a couple of years, we're going to come up on the 30th anniversary of that, which is just, 40th anniversary, 30th, we already hit the 30th, the 40th anniversary of that is going to be coming up soon. So, yeah, I mean, very, very sad event to happen. And again, for such a fun movie, I think to dedicate, to be dedicated to those lives, I thought was a really important thing. So, it's something, again, we'll always see it. Every time somebody watches Star Trek 4, they're going to see that and, know what that is. And if they're not familiar with it, they will look it up online, find out on Wikipedia, and know. So I think it's a really great memorial as well to them to have that in the movie that way. All right, so yeah, I guess that is enough. I think we've covered enough on this. We're almost closing in on 45 minutes here talking about Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. So again, I think this one holds up more for me than it did originally, right? I think again I was down on it more than I probably should have. I think for most people have this one as their number 2, and now I kind of officially have it as my number 2 as well. I think Part 2 is their number 1, is their best one, and then this one comes right after it. And I think it still holds up in that realm. I think this is always a lot of fun. But I think it's also, for someone, if you haven't seen it in a long time, it's kind of fun to watch in sort of both with modern eyes, but, in the context of what kind of movies were coming out at that time. Yeah, well, why don't we wrap this up here? So, of course, with me doing a solo episode here, we'll do my own plugs here. So my newest novel, Don's House in the Mountains. I know it doesn't seem so new anymore. It's been out for about 7 months now, so I got to get something else out there soon. But Don's House in the Mountains, it is available in Kindle and paperback if you want to pick that up. Also, Bainbridge, my short action novel covering sort of throwback to 90s action and direct-to-video action. Great, fun short novel, maybe like I think it's like 60 pages, something like that. But also I kind of made the font a little bit bigger because it's very short. It's like 25,000 words, so it's an easy read. You can pick that up on Kindle or in paperback as well. Then, of course, we have a Threadless account. So you can always go to the DTVC Threadless. The link to that is in the podcast description for all your DTVC merch needs. So if you want some T-shirts, mugs, anything like that, you can get them there. And I'm always appreciative of anything that anybody wants to pick up. All right, well then I think we're good here. So why don't we wrap up? We'll 2 weeks we'll get back. We'll be back here and we'll be looking at numbers 5 and 6. But until then, talk soon. Bye, everyone.
Direct to video, direct to video.